Hello and welcome to another episode of the God is a Geek Retrocast. I'm your host Lee Garbett, and joining me again in our virtual studio is my colleague Robin Parker.
Hey there.
So we're going to cover another classic. I think we're making up for that Bubsy episode because everything else this month has been absolutely fantastic. We're going to be covering Streets of Rage 2, which again, much like Gunstar Heroes last week, is probably one of my favourite games of all time. So it's so good to be able to talk about it.
Yeah, I think you put yourself through some punishment by having to play Bubsy, so now you're having a bit of a reward being able to play some of these top games.
Yeah, everything else has been a treat. Of course, nothing makes up for having to play Bubsy, but this comes pretty damn close, I think.
Yeah, of course. I mean, it carries on more or less where Streets of Rage 1 left off. Mr. X, who you thought you defeated in the first game, comes back, and you've got a new set, two returning heroes and two new heroes to play as in this game.
Yeah, of course. So Streets of Rage 2 came out. Well, it came out around Christmas time in I believe it was 92 in America, and like January 93 in Japan and Europe, I believe.
Yep.
Yeah, I remember this game when it came out very, very fondly. It's the original Streets of Rage was like a massive hit on the Mega Drive. It was one of the standout titles, and I think it was one of those games that it was up there with Sonic as a game you had to own. But this sequel is one of the best sequels ever made, as far as I'm concerned.
Oh yeah, I mean it improved in almost every way over the original in terms of graphics, sound, and gameplay. It was everything. I mean, not to say Streets of Rage 1 was bad, but Streets of Rage 2 just refined everything and made it more fun, just made it a better experience overall.
Yeah, I think, at least visually, Streets of Rage 1, it hasn't aged as well as this game does. I mean, all the redrawn sprites look absolutely fantastic, and they're all really detailed. It's colourful. We've got pinks and oranges and blues and purples and greens all on the same screen here, and it looks fantastic.
Yeah, it's all just the sprites are just that bit cleaner and crisper than the first game. There's more detail, the animation is smoother, but the gameplay is just as good. I mean, it's basically the presentation's 10 times better, than the game's just as good as the first one.
Certainly, and they really did tighten up the gameplay for this one. I mean, not that the original was a slouch in any form whatsoever, but they've added special moves, different ways of attacking. They've taken out the cop car screen killing special weapon, which I kind of miss, but it's nice to see some more normal special moves. I mean, it almost feels like it's almost kind of taken a bit off a Street Fighter, the way some of the attacks are a bit more outlandish.
Yeah, but you even have little basic combos as well. It's just a lot more things to add a bit of variety to the attacking in this game. So it's not just. I mean, the first one was fairly basic, really, in terms of your move set. So it just makes it a lot more interesting.
Of course, and long-time Retrocast listeners watchers in fact will remember when we did the Final Fight episode, and we were remarking about how similar some of the enemies were from Final Fight to Streets of Rage 2, and you can definitely see that here. I mean, some of these enemies are ripped from Final Fight. They're just a bit smaller and not quite as detailed as Final Fight, but they're recognisable.
Yeah, and of course Final Fight, Double Dragon, Streets of Rage, they all sort of are familiar in terms of their setting, and of course they all have the same sort of weapons which became staples of the genre, having the lead pipe, the knife. It's all just these games, in a way, when you look at them, they're sort of cookie cutter games, but when you play them, they're very different experiences.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder if it's some sort of how the Japanese see American streets, I think, or punks,
Yeah, that might be it.
The Japanese version of the game was called Bare Knuckle 2, which I always preferred Bare Knuckle to Streets of Rage. I found it a much better title, but they stuck with Streets of Rage, of course.
Yeah, it's a bit more gritty, Bare Knuckle, I think, definitely. It's the Streets of Rage. I mean, I suppose it's maybe a bit of a less rough edge to it. Maybe if Sega of America and Europe weren't quite so happy with that.
Of course, and the box art for the American and European version of Streets of Rage is a bit more serious than the Japanese version, which is, I believe, was ripped off of a very random movie cover, almost I think there's also like it's supposed to be Mr. X, but it kind of looks a bit like Arnold Schwarzenegger in the background of the Japanese box art. It's very, very odd. But no such oddities in the game itself. I mean, it's pretty similar between the two versions as far as I know. I mean, yeah, other than probably a few localization differences.
Yeah, it's more or less the same experience, I think.
Yeah. So it's just fighting in a bar, which seems a bit normal at this point, actually.
Yeah, I mean, you start to think this is more or less what you'd expect from a brawler like this.
And then hopefully we'll get to why it kind of drastically changes a bit later on.
Yeah, I mean, what the game really changed between the first and second, with the addition of the 2 extra fighters in from Streets of Rage for Streets of Rage 2, who didn't feature in the first game. They just give you they give you sort of slightly different fighting styles, and you've got, of course, the Adam's younger brother, Skate, or Eddie, who's sort of got the speed, and he's got like the skating moves, and then you've got the sort of the big man as well. So you've got a few different sort of styles in this game, and whereas in the first game, I suppose Adam and Blaze were very similar fighters. Adam and Axel, sorry, and Blaze was the only offered a little bit of difference, but not a major difference because of the limited moveset. But in this game, they all play quite differently with 4 characters.
Yeah, I mean, personally, I used to always go for Blaze, or occasionally Skate, or Sammy, as he was. I believe he was known in Japan. Just I like that bit of speed. I like being able to be agile, and I'm not too worried about how powerful my hits are as long as I can get them in quickly. How about yourself, Robin?
Oh, I always like the brawling characters. I think it's sort of stemmed from Final Fight with Hager. So I was always the sort of wrestler types in these sort of games.
Max.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah, I always found him to be a bit too sluggish. I mean, he could do some devastating moves and lariats and the like, but I like my characters to be quick and.
Yeah, I think in single player it's a bit of a hindrance, but when you play in 2-player, and if one of you is Max and perhaps one of you Blaze, it's a good complementary styles, having one powerhouse and one speed character. So I mean, that's where the game for me always truly came alive in 2-player.
Oh, certainly. I mean, it was a shame there was no 4-player option because that would have been amazing to have all 4 fighters taken to the streets. But,
oh, definitely.
Alas, it was never to be.
No, it was a bit early in the system's life cycle before 4-player and multi-tap and 4-socket cartridges had sort of all come into existence, really.
I will say something. There was the token, the famous Streets of Rage move was the grapple somebody and jump over them and then throw them, and that has never stopped being satisfying in my eyes.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun, that move. I mean,
especially when you do it with 2 players as well, and you get to throw the other person and they do a drop kick. That is the classiest way to dispatch of enemies.
Yeah, the game actually kind of almost did allow for double team manoeuvres, which the first game didn't necessarily. It wasn't quite as easy to pull things off like that off, but just the different movesets in the second game made that sort of thing possible.
It was the kind of thing you do by accident and spend ages trying to figure out how you did it again, because it was just one of the most jaw-dropping things you'd ever see in a game of this type.
Yeah, sure.
This is a very strange level where we're fighting motorcyclists, as you'll see every now and then. One will race by and probably run me over in the process, which is definitely an unusual part of a brawler.
No, and this level is somewhat reminiscent of a level in Turtles in Time, the game we covered last month. There's the first stage is a bridge level, which graphically looks very similar to this one.
Ah, yes, that's a good point. I didn't realise that. That's now you've mentioned it, I can very much see that resemblance.
Just goes to show how sort of seaside scrolling brawlers, they all do like to use the same sort of settings and locations. It's just iconic. I mean, if you had a brawler where you didn't go to a bar or a back street, you'd be a bit disappointed, probably.
Of course. And speaking of iconic, we've obviously got the once again famous Yuzo Koshiro created soundtrack. This is probably one of the best soundtracks he's ever done, in my opinion. What was amazing was that it's it's a soundtrack that almost mimicked the kind of rave music of the time. It's almost like it almost predicted rave, that kind of rave sounds. Even though he was millions of miles away in Japan, he'd come up with this soundtrack that perfectly encapsulated the musical trends of the time, at least in terms of clubs.
Yeah, I mean, you wonder if he did. It wouldn't be surprising if he'd done research into sort of American music of the time to try and make it fit in with the setting of the game.
And it's all sorts of different tracks. You've got like jazzy style tracks like the one that's playing at the moment. You've got proper dance club tunes which fit perfectly. Everything fits incredibly well. It's just one of the most amazing soundtracks, especially when you consider that at the time the way Yuzo Koshiro composed music was that he was never he wasn't exactly a guy who did music theory. It was more that his approach to composition, I believe, was more mathematics. That he was actually a sound programmer, and although he didn't know music theory, he'd know the mathematics of what notes went with what, and that's how he'd approach composing. And, that kind of thing is incredibly amazing to come out with results such as this. Yeah,
it's a unique way of composing music, and you wouldn't imagine you'd get such successful results as this.
And he was very experimental, and I believe in Streets of Rage 3, which although didn't have as good a soundtrack, he did try different things, such as I think he actually wrote a piece of software that did a random note generator for some of the levels, so that all the music was different. It's an unusual, very unusual approach to a game composition, even in this generation.
It's always good when whether it be a designer, a composer, a director, when they try something different, which maybe pushes the envelope. It might not work 9 times out of 10, but if they're willing to take that risk, and the developers allowing them to take that risk, I mean that's what you want to see more often in games, where a bit of freedom is given to the creative people to try new things.
It is, and it goes to show. I mean, Yuzo Koshiro is synonymous with Streets of Rage because of that soundtrack. That is the first thing you think about. Even though as good as the gameplay itself is, you think of the soundtrack first because it is that. It goes hand in hand, and you couldn't have Streets of Rage without that soundtrack.
No, of course, and it's just. Of course, it happens with these type of games. It's bound to that you hear that soundtrack over and over again as you go through the levels. But it's just a testament to that the success of that soundtrack. But it doesn't, it's not one of the soundtracks which you hate. You remember it fondly. A lot of games where you were constantly replaying them and having to replay, you'd learn to hate the music quickly. But you definitely don't with Streets of Rage.
No, I mean, this is one of those few examples of a soundtrack that I'm actually happy to have on my iPod, and I do. I actually listen to the tracks from this and the other Streets of Rage games because they're that listenable, and
as long as it doesn't make you walk through the streets looking for people to beat up.
I kind of get that feeling. You put those tracks on, you do feel like kind of strutting down the street with a lead pipe in your hands. I must admit, I have got into that mindset where I actually find myself to start strutting along like I'm walking through a street in this game. It's
looking
quite
for
worrying.
bottles of thrust in somebody's face.
Yeah, it's quite worrying. It's definitely fighting music.
Got to hold yourself back sometimes.
Yeah, and they say games don't cause violence. Game soundtracks do.
Oh, of course. That's okay then.
Yeah. This is a weird level, so we're kind of in a fairground at the moment. So this is where things get to start really weird all of a sudden.
Yeah, at the start of a level, you see almost a Disneyland castle in the background there. So
yeah.
I mean, obviously not going to make itself look like Disneyland per se, but that's obviously the look they were going for. This adds a bit of variety to proceedings, really, because the first game, could have been. You could blame it for being a bit bland in its level design. It was all a bit monotone, dark, dingy streets. Whereas this game does mix things up a little bit and add a bit of more interesting colour and variety into the mix.
As you can see, there's a few bare knuckle arcade machines there. Streets of Rage 2 would of course find its way into the arcades because Sega actually did release a version of the Mega Drive / Genesis that you would put coins in, so it did actually find its way into the arcades eventually as part of that scheme. And of course Nintendo did a very similar thing with the NES and the SNES as well.
Yeah, it's this brawler genre sort of going full circle, because I mean it obviously started off in the arcades with Double Dragon and stuff, but it kind of really got refined in the 16-bit era on the home console.
certainly. I'll never get tired of throwing people around in this. It's quite an effective move as well. I mean, it takes a lot of damage, some of these moves.
No, and a well placed throw would take out 3 or 4 other opponents as well if you were getting crowded. So there was a lot of tactics to the throwing and different manoeuvres in the game.
I kind of love how randomly we're just in a pirate area. There's no explanation of why, or but we're here and we're fighting punks.
I suppose that's by placing you into a theme park, it allows them to make any levels they want, I suppose, because they can say, oh, it's just an area for theme park. We can be pirates, we can have medieval times, we can do whatever we want.
Well, there's a part of the level in the second where you're actually fighting a Geiger-esque alien as a boss, mini boss, which is just incredibly unusual, completely out of the left field as well.
Completely, but it definitely makes the game more interesting.
Definitely. It's just one of those games that again, it's short enough to be played again and again and again because it's that enjoyable, and it's been re-released so many times, but it's one of those games that I don't mind it being re-released, because I mean there must be someone that hasn't played this game by now, and someone. Yeah,
I mean it hasn't had sort of a full HD remake treatment that some other games have, but I don't think it needs it, because I mean some games you just want to have the retro charm of the sprites. You don't necessarily want everything smooth and redrawn. I mean, this is the style. The visual style is a big part of the game.
Yeah, it's got a nice chunky sprites, and of course you can track down a Sega Mega Drive or Genesis to play this game in its original form. If you want to go for a slightly more lower res version, you can play this game on the Game Gear or the Master System, should you want to. If you could track down the Sega Mega Play arcade machine as well, you could probably play down there if you want to go that far. But for most of us, it may well be easier to pick up one of the game's many digital versions. There's the Virtual Console on the Wii, of course, which I guess will carry over to the Wii U at some point. You've got several versions of it on Xbox Live Arcade and PlayStation Network, but I highly recommend going for the Streets of Rage collection. I think it's the Vintage collection it's called. That actually has all 3 versions, and it actually has all the region versions as well. And there are actually differences between the regions of some of the games, especially Streets of Rage 3. If you're really desperate for Streets of Rage on the go, there is the iOS version, which I probably wouldn't recommend just because there are no buttons, just the touchscreen. And of course there are versions on the PC as well. And then there was the Sega Mega Drive collection from a few years ago that had all 3 Streets of Rage games in. But I think if you want to go for the best version, you definitely try and pick up the Streets of Rage Vintage collection, which is the most complete and most detailed version of these games yet.
You've got so many options.
It is, and it's unfortunate they've never really brought Streets of Rage back as a series. I mean, many times it's been done. IDOS Interactive and Core Design's Fighting Force was originally designed to be a version of Streets of Rage on the Saturn, but the license fell through, even though the game did get released. Then of course there was the Ruffian of Crackdown 2 fame that worked on a version of the game that was kind of leaked out last year, and it looked okay, but I don't think it quite captured the essence. And there was a Dreamcast version planned as well, but again, unfortunately that didn't come to fruition. So it's been one of those games that really hasn't come back. And I don't think it's without people trying, but
the brawling game just hasn't really translated into 3D. It's never made the transition successfully, unfortunately. I think it could, but it just never has.
No, I think keeping it 2D is perfectly fine. I mean, we've seen the likes of Castle Crashers and Scott Pilgrim in recent years that proves that these 2D brawlers can still be great and entertaining and feel fresh.
Oh, definitely. It's just I think it sort of suffered a bit of a death at the time when gamers seemed to only want 3D titles, and but people, like you said, Core had to go into 3D with Fighting Force, because I think if it had been 2D at the time, just no one would have looked at it, and it just didn't translate quite as well.
No, it's a big shame. Maybe one day we will see that Streets of Rage sequel, that Streets of Rage 4 that we all know and want. But unfortunately, it hasn't come to date yet. Okay, so that's it for this week's God is a Geek Retrocast. You can watch all of our past, present and future episodes via the Retrocast playlist on the God is a Geek YouTube channel. You can also check us out via the God is a Geek TV channel on blip.tv, the God is a Geek TV podcast channel on iTunes, and of course by visiting our website at www.godisageek.com. We can also check out all of our fine podcasts, as plus all the usual videos, news, reviews, previews and features of course. And if you'd like to be regularly updated about the show and want to chat with us about anything retro gaming or Retrocast related, you can also follow us on Twitter at the Retrocast. Of course, we'd love to hear from you. If you ever want to leave us any comments on YouTube videos or on iTunes, if you want to rate us, that'd be very thankful. We'd love to hear from you about the show. So until next week, we thank you for watching the God is a Geek Retrocast, and until next time, keep it retro.
See you then.